secular thinking is that the earth, as I said before, is 4.5 billion years old, and they claim they cannot find evidence for the flood 4,500 years ago. They say that the flood was only a local event in Mesopotamia, but the Bible is very clear. There's more space devoted to the flood account in Genesis than there is to the creation account. And there's a unique word used for the flood that's only mentioned in Genesis and also in Psalms. It's the word Mabul. It's a unique Hebrew word that describes the flood in Genesis. And God said he was going to bring a flood upon the earth to destroy all flesh. Everything on the earth shall die. Now that doesn't describe a local event at all. And Jesus spoke of Noah and the flood as real history in Matthew 24. And he compared it to his second coming. As in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the coming of the days of the Son of Man. Now, if Jesus compared his second coming, which is global, to the flood has to be global. Otherwise, Jesus is not telling us the truth. And one of his, there it is there, there's the verse of Scripture. And Jesus said, the flood came and swept them all away. Not some, all away. So shall it be in the coming of the Son of Man. One of his listeners was the Apostle Peter. And in 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter describes the world that then existed being deluged by water and perishing. And he compares it with the fiery judgment to come. He also describes it with the earth being formed out of water, as Colonel Williams described it, and as we said before, God originally created the earth covered in water, and then he made the land on the third day out of that water. And so if Peter is comparing creation and the flood and the second coming as global, then the flood had to be global. And the purpose of the flood was not only to destroy man, but the earth itself. So it had to be a global event if it was to destroy the earth as well. God says in Genesis 6 verse 7, I will blot out man, whom I created from the face of the earth. And the birds. By the way, which creatures are mentioned the most in the flood account? Birds. You can count them up, the number of times they're mentioned. It was a local flood. The birds could fly somewhere else. And God said to Noah, I will make an end of all flesh. I will destroy them with the earth. So God is making it clear that this Mabul, this flood of waters, is going to destroy all flesh, which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die. And that's why we know the scale of the flood was global. Why would God get Noah to build the ark, an ocean-going vessel of that size? I mean, after all, if it was only a local flood, all God had to do was to instruct Noah to pack up and move house away from the area that was going to be affected. No, the need of an ark was needed because all flesh, the whole globe, was going to be returned to water again. It was going to be uncreated, returned to its initial watery condition that we read about in Genesis. So Noah would have had ample warning. He could have simply migrated to a safer place elsewhere. And Noah was to take on board 2 of every kind of land-dwelling, air-breathing creature and food. I mean, a local flood, that wouldn't have been necessary. A regional flood, that wouldn't have been necessary. God said, every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark, and to take food for them. And as I said earlier this morning, and birds are mentioned here again, God brought the animals to Noah, and I'm glad he did, because he could choose the best ones. And again, if the flood was only local, why did Noah have to take on board 2 of every kind of land-dwelling, air-breathing creature? The animals could have just escaped to another area. In fact, it's well known that animals will detect, for example, an earthquake before humans will. They detect danger and move away from the danger area. As I said before, why are birds mentioned so often in Genesis? Because they could simply fly over the mountains and escape from a local flood. The purpose of the flood was to destroy or blot out all mankind. And that word blot out is utterly destroy. That's why we don't find any human fossils of pre-flood humans, because God said he was going to utterly destroy man. An interesting point that we might return to in question time. But how could all the animals and birds be destroyed around the surface of the earth unless the flood was global in its outreach? Remember, God said, I have determined to make an end of all flesh. Why? Because the earth is filled with violence, and I will destroy them with the earth. The tragedy is that we're told that man had become more and more violent. We'll return to that in a moment. Jesus, again, as I said before, specifically in those passages of scriptures, compared the flood to his global second coming. And Peter, again. These are reasons why we know the flood was global in scale, because there are other references outside the book of Genesis. Peter said, and this is important, he said, in the last days there will come scoffers, and they'll deliberately reject or overlook the evidence that the heavens existed long ago and the earth was formed out of water by the word of God, and that the world that then existed was deluged with water and perished. And the flood, the earth, heavens and earth that are now exist are stored up by fire. Again, the comparison between creation, the flood, and the second coming. Who are the scoffers he's referring to? The geologists, because it's the geologists who deny that there was a global flood. They deny that the fossils are evidence of the global flood. They deliberately reject the testimony of God's word. And in Genesis, when we read the account of the flood through Genesis 6 through 9, there's a repetition of everywhere under the heavens. And God is making it very clear, remember this is God's eyewitness record, that the repetition of all and every is comprehensive. God is making it very clear in his eyewitness testimony that the flood was global. We read in Genesis 7, 9 to 19, 20, the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole of the heaven were covered. And the waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. That's a cubit. By the way, this is not saying the waters covered Mount Everest. Mount Everest was produced by the flood. At the top of Mount Everest, we've got fossils. Mount Everest consists of fossil-bearing sedimentary layers that were pushed up at the end of the flood. So don't ever let anyone try to tell you, oh, there had to be enough water to cover Mount Everest. No, Mount Everest is a product of the flood. The mountains, the Himalayas, are very recent, because Psalm 104 says at the end of the flood, the valley sank, the mountains rose. The waters retreated to the boundaries that God set. They'll never cover the earth again. So do local floods ever cover all the high mountains? I mean, remember, the waters are going to rise till they cover a mountain and then going to flow over into the next valley. So you've got to keep on topping it up, it keeps on flowing to the next valley, the next valley. All flesh died, all swimming creatures, all mankind, everything on the dry land, every living creature, every living thing. Only Noah was left, and those who were with him on the ark. And the depth of the flood, it's at least 25 feet, as I said. The highest mountains of the time, the pre-flood mountains, we're not talking about Mount Everest. the reference here to 25 feet, that was the displacement, half the height of the ark. It meant that the waters covered the earth to at least the draft of the ark so that it could float on a global ocean. And here's another interesting point. Has a local flood ever lasted for 371 days? Do we ever experience 40 days and 40 nights of global torrential rain? You have a week of torrential rain and it's devastating. But lasting that long? No local flood lasted that long. And we know the timetable of the flood because God makes it very clear in how old Noah was when the flood began, specifically here in Genesis chapter 7, verse 11. And we know when the flood ended because when God told Noah to go out the ark, it was 371 days after the flood had started. So a local flood doesn't last that long. And here's another interesting point. The ark landed on a mountaintop, not in a valley. You know, there are some Christians who compromise on this issue and, you know, they claim it was the flood was in the Mesopotamian valley. You think about it. The ark, if it was floating on waters in the Mesopotamian valley, where would the flood waters go when they drained out of the valley? Down into the Persian Gulf. Where did the ark land? On the mountains of Ararat in the opposite direction. Not Mount Ararat, it says the mountains of Ararat. Mount Ararat is a recent post-flood volcano. The ark landed on the mountains of Ararat on day 150 of the ark, barely halfway into the flood. So it couldn't have landed on modern Mount Ararat because that even erupted as late as 1840, the last major eruption. And why would Noah have to take the animals on the ark to repopulate the earth? If it was only a local flood, animals from outside the flood area would migrate in to repopulate it. I mean, that's what happened with Mount St. Helens eruption. It got repopulated after the devastation of the eruption. And God told Noah and the animals to repopulate the earth. They went out from the region of the mountains of Ararat, and they eventually were told to repopulate the whole earth. And originally they had disobeyed God, didn't they? And he had to send a judgment at the Tower of Babel to get them to disperse. Oh, by the way, the animals dispersed like God told them to. So primates reached Africa very soon after the flood. Humans didn't reach Africa until after the Tower of Babel. So when the paleontologists come along and dig up ape fossils and then human fossils above that, they say, oh, apes evolved into humans. No, the apes got to Africa before the humans did because the apes dispersed under God's command straight after they got off the ark, but humans disobeyed God and didn't come till later. See how easy it is to explain details once you get the biblical account in view. Okay, let's move on. The outcomes of the flood. All mankind and all land-dwelling animals and plants outside the ark were destroyed, and the earth's surface was totally destroyed and reshaped. And let's emphasize this again. All flesh, all swarming creatures, all mankind, everything were blotted out. So, if the flood really did occur, what evidence would you and I expect to find in the earth today? Wouldn't we expect to find evidence of billions of dead animals and plants, called fossils, buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the globe on every continent? Absolutely. That's exactly what we find on every continent. billions of dead things called fossils buried in rock layers that were laid down by water. So, what do the fossils teach us? We find these fossils, they're very well preserved, often with exquisite details. Now, have you ever tried to fossilise an animal? Say, you put a dead cow out in the fields out here. Is it going to fossilise? No. It's going to rot. It's going to get eaten by scavengers. To preserve animals in exquisite details requires instant encapsulation in the sand and mud. They have to be very, very rapidly so they don't decay or get eaten by scavengers. And thus, rapid burial in a catastrophe is necessary for fossilisation. And since fossils are found globally, the evidence is consistent with the biblical flood. So, excuse me, how does a fossil fish get fossilised? Look at this beautifully preserved specimen here. You can see the eye sockets, the fins, the ribs. Well, this big guy here is hungry. He's about to have some breakfast. And he goes to swallow this fish here. He doesn't realise that there's sand and mud coming down on him. And he gets entombed, and there he is. There's hundreds of these fossils found just like that. Did that take millions of years to form that fossil? Did that take a week? No. It was instant. The big guy didn't get time to finish his breakfast before the two of them were buried and fossilised. What about this fossil here? That's a marine reptile called an ichthyosaur that's 6 feet long, been fossilised giving birth to a baby. Exquisitely preserved, catastrophically buried. There's countless examples like this all around the globe. That's in Germany. That was in a museum in Germany. And there's a number of these from the same location. That's not a flower, that's a fossilised jellyfish. It was found in outback South Australia back in 1946. And the geologists who found them over an area of 400 square miles, and he realised they had to form in less than a day. Why? Because a jellyfish washed up on the beach is going to melt in the sun or get destroyed by the waves pounding on the beach. Or these crinoids or sea lilies. These are not plants. The animal lives in that little head, and it makes these discs to make up these columns and these fronds that collect food particles. And when they die, fall apart. These have been buried alive. Or a fossilised wasp. That's from just west of Colorado Springs, by the way, and the Florence area. Or flowers. How do you fossilise a flower slowly? See, the fossils teach us that rapid burial in a catastrophe is necessary for fossilisation. And as I said before, since the fossils are found globally, the evidence is consistent with the biblical flood, and that's what Genesis 7 describes. So, again, if the flood really did occur, what evidence would you expect to find today? Billions of dead things. Fossils buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth. No local flood covered all the high mountains under the whole heaven, but only a global flood would bury all the billions of dead things in rock layers laid down by all over the earth, the sedimentary rock layers. Now, here's another interesting thing. What are the predominant fossils that we find, and where do we find those fossils? The predominant fossils we find are shallow water marine creatures, corals, clams. They lived on the ocean floor before the flood. Do we find them today buried on the ocean floor? No. We find them buried up on the continents. We find them buried at the top of Mount Everest. The fossil record is predominantly marine fossils. and they're found buried up on the continents. How did they get there unless the ocean waters rose up and covered the continents? You know, most geologists miss that point, that the marine fossils are found buried up on the continents. And as I said before, that means the ocean waters had to pick them up and bury them up on the continents. By the way, when we look at the billions of fossils that we find of these shallow water marine creatures, corals and clams, the volume of those fossils tell us what the pre-flood world might have been like. Today, the shallow waters are only close to the continents. In the pre-flood world, most of the oceans were probably shallow. The earth is a desert compared with the profusion of life that God must have created. And that's what it says in Genesis chapter 1. God created to swarm, to swarm. So how did the ocean waters rise to cover the continents? Well, we're told the answer is the fountains of the great deep broke open. Now, I believe that every word order in Scripture is significant. The Holy Spirit could have said, the windows of heaven opened, and then the fountains of the great deep broke open. No, he tells us that the fountains of the deep broke open, and then the windows of heaven were opened. The ocean floor split apart, the pre-flood ocean floor split apart, and water came bursting out from inside the earth. Superheated water burst out. And that superheated water, we believe, went up as steam jets, supersonic steam jets, carrying ocean water up into the atmosphere, which then fell back to the earth as global torrential rain. We're told in the 600th year of Noah's life, the second month, on the seventh day of the month, see, God was precise. On that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, were broken up, and the windows of heaven were open. So what do the fossils teach us? Not only do we find the fossils in ones and twos, we find them in accumulations called graveyards. You know, you put people, bury them side by side in a graveyard, lots of people buried together. Well, we usually find the fossils buried in graveyards, lots of them together, and some of these graveyards are layers that extend around the globe. So here's a fossil graveyard of trilobites. They're from Morocco. They didn't live like that, by the way. They were buried like that. Oh, this is an interesting point. You know, you go to museums and they have the fossils on display, and they have this diorama of what it probably looked like where the creatures lived before they became fossilised. Did we find that diorama? No. We just find the fossils. That's an interpretation. You see, we weren't there to witness where the creatures lived. So where we find them, is that where they lived? We don't know. We weren't there to see it. Was this where they died? Well, no, we weren't there to see where they died. Is this where they were buried? Yes. That's the only thing we know for sure, because we witness today where they're buried, because we dig them up where they were buried. They lived in the ocean because they're sea-dwelling creatures, but they were buried up on the earth, on the continents. Here's another graveyard. This is around the Cincinnati area where I left from yesterday to come here. Very well known. Billions of corals, clams, brachiopods or lamp shells, crinoids or coelides, bryozoans or lace corals, all buried together en masse in a layer that you can trace further down south in Kentucky. You can trace it all the way up to Niagara Falls. We can say more about that in a moment. Here's another fossil graveyard. This is in the Grand Canyon, one of the limestones in the Grand Canyon. Those coelides that were stacked columns, you can see the discs there, an overview, and then you can see a side-on view of where they were stacked together in a column. They're all broken apart. They were smashed when they were buried. Here's another example from the Grand Canyon. Each of those streaks are horn corals. And by the way, you can see they're all buried at all different angles. They didn't live that way. They all lived like this. But now they're buried every which way, which speaks of catastrophic burial, sudden burial. This is an interesting fossil graveyard. This is in southern Israel, near Maktesh Ramon. And it's called the Ammonite Wall. See the boy there for scale? Notice what we're going to zoom in on. Each of those you can see the rough surface there. There are hundreds of these coiled ammonite shells, quite large. You can see the lens cap of my camera there for scale. Many of these creatures swarming and buried, a school of these ammonites just slammed. Let's go to a few examples. We can go to France, where we find hundreds of thousands of marine creatures buried with amphibians, spiders, scorpions, millipedes, insects and reptiles. Notice there's a mixture there. You often find that they talk in the museums and the textbooks. They say, you start with marine creatures, and then as they evolved onto the land, and then we got land creatures. What they don't tell you is that the land animals are buried with marine creatures because the ocean waters were still flooding over the continents. By the way, it's important to remember when the flood began, it began in the oceans. So which creatures would be affected first by the flood catastrophe? The shallow water marine creatures that lived on the ocean floor. So which creatures would you expect to be buried first? Those marine creatures. And then as the ocean waters covered the continents, you'd also got land-dwelling creatures buried. So the order of the fossils in the fossil record, there is an order. You can walk from the bottom of the Grand Canyon all the way up to Bryce Canyon, and there's an order of the fossils there. That order is the burial order of the flood. It's not an evolutionary order, it's the burial order of the flood. As different pre-flood environments, ecosystems were progressively destroyed. What they don't tell you is that certain dinosaurs are only found with certain plants. They lived in different habitats. And as the floodwaters rose, whole habitats were swept away and buried together. We go to Florissant, just out west of Colorado Springs. We find a variety of insects, freshwater mollusks, fish, birds. How do you bury a bird slowly? With nuts and blossoms, okay? There's one of those fish from the Florissant beds, just west of Colorado Springs. There's the wasp again. There's one of those flowers. Fossilisation was extensive. It was sudden. Preservation. Here's another interesting fossil graveyard. The Green River Formation in Wyoming. Alligator, fish, 3 to 7 feet long. Some of these are deep sea fish. Birds, turtles, mammals, including bats. I mean, how do you fossilise a bat slowly? Again, you've got a mixture of land, air, and sea-dwelling creatures or water-dwelling creatures all buried together. That's not the way they lived. That's the way they were buried by the flood. Palm leaves. I went out to Wyoming to organise for these fossils. That's on the third deck of our Ark encounter, our full-size scale reproduction of the Ark there over in Kentucky. Here's an Australian example. I have to give you some Australian examples. Our island state of Tasmania, on the north coast, there's a cliff called Fossil Bluff. And in that cliff, we find in a limestone thousands of marine creatures, corals, bryozoans, mollusks. Bryozoans are lace corals, they're still around today. Mollusks are ordinary clams, buried with a toothed whale and a marsupial possum. Okay, here's the cliff, and that's about 80 foot high, the limestone there. And these are many broken shells with pebbles, indicating a mass burial. You need high energy of water to move those pebbles, to break those shells. So it wasn't slow and gradual. It was a catastrophe. And we find the remains of a toothed whale that's on display in the Capitol Museum in the capital, Hobart, and also the remains of the marsupial possum. By the way, when did you find whales and possums living together? How would they be buried together unless it was a catastrophe that affected both the deep ocean and the land at the same time? Here's one of my favourite fossil graveyards. Chalk beds. And you can see the Niobrara chalk here in Colorado. It's the most westerly point. You can go down to Colorado Springs and you can see it outcropping. It's made up of trillions of microscopic marine creatures. And it's also got other fossils in it. Chalk is a type of limestone. And we can see it. Here's the chalk cliffs of the English Channel coast, which are the most famous chalk beds. The chalk there is 1,000 feet thick. And you can trace it. You can trace it under London. You can trace it under the Irish Sea. And we can see it again in Northern Ireland. Under the microscope, it's made up of trillions of microscopic shells. Okay, so you can trace it. You can trace it across to Northern Ireland, but you can trace it all the way across Europe, down to Egypt, to Israel, and to Kazakhstan. By the way, at the base of that cliff is a dry brook from which a shepherd boy collected 5 smooth stones to go and slay a giant. It's the same chalk beds that we find on the English Channel coast. And the same chalk beds are in the Midwest of the United States, from Alabama and Arkansas, across to Colorado, from down in Texas, all the way up to Nebraska. The same chalk beds. As I said, we drilled down under this building, you'd hit those chalk beds very quickly. And the same chalk beds are found in southern Western Australia. The same fossils, the same layers above, the same layers below. So we're talking about the remnants of a global scale fossil graveyard. Well, how long did it take to form a global scale fossil grave? Let's look at some of the fossils that are found in the Niobrara chalk, which is the name given to the chalk here in the Midwest. And this is in Kansas, because you can go on the I-70, call in to Fort Hays, and you can go to the Sternberg Museum and you can see these fossils on display. So it's not me conjuring up this evidence. You can see the fossils for yourself. And you ask yourself the question, did it take millions of years to fossilise these creatures? See these crinoids? You saw the ones broken up before in the Grand Canyon, or bits and pieces. These are the whole heads. We know that means rapid burial and preservation. How about this? There's a fish 12 feet long with an undigested fish in its stomach. Did that take millions of years to be buried and fossilised? Or pliosaur and turtle fossils. They're all on display in that museum. These pliosaurs, 15, 18 feet long. Turtles, 10, 12 feet across. And dinosaur and bird fossils, all in the chalk. Now, why is this significant? Why am I emphasising this point? The reason is most scientists, most geologists who believe that the present is the key to the past, the scoffers that Peter talks about in 2 Peter chapter 3, sadly, most of my geological colleagues will tell you that limestones like chalk, well, where does it form today? It forms on the ocean floor. It's called calcareous ooze. If you do oceanography, you'll learn about that. And it accumulates at a rate of a few millimetres, a fraction of an inch every 1,000 years. And so, the chalk cliffs in England, the chalk layers are supposed to be 1,000 feet thick. They say it took at least 20 million years to form that 1,000 feet of chalk. Well, tell me, you see, this is why Peter says they are willingly ignorant. They've got blinkers on. They can't see the evidence that's staring in the face. At the rate of a fraction of an inch every 1,000 years, how are you going to bury a fish with an undigested fish in its stomach? How are you going to bury huge turtles and dinosaurs and birds before they rot or get eaten by scavengers? You see, the evidence is screaming at us that they're wrong. The textbooks are wrong. They ignore this because the problem is a spiritual one. Because if they accept that this is evidence for the flood described in Genesis, then that means there's a God who created us to whom we have to give an account. No, to get these creatures buried, it required burial on a catastrophic scale at meters. That's tens of feet per minute on a global scale to produce these chalk layers. By the way, you interested in that kind of information that you want to use? Well, go to the Answers in Genesis website, type in the word chalk, and you get the article I wrote that was in the Answers magazine some years ago. And you can see these details for yourself. All the information in my presentations are found generally on the Answers in Genesis website. And so a global cataclysm is necessary to bury air, land, and sea-dwelling creatures on a global encircling scale of these chalk layers. And that's exactly what we'd expect based on what is described in Genesis. Well, we saw the Grand Canyon from space. Now we're going to look at it from the south rim of the Grand Canyon. And you know, geologists are smart people. Limestone is lime that turned to stone. Pretty smart, isn't it? The trouble is, in the Grand Canyon, there's more than one limestone layer. So geologists attach another name. So the limestone at the top is called the Kaibab limestone, and this limestone halfway down is called the Red Wall limestone. Can you see why we call it the Red Wall limestone? I told you geologists were smart. It forms a red cliff, a red wall. And this is the same view that you see if you came with me on a rafting trip down the Grand Canyon, through the Grand Canyon. You see the same red wall limestone. And it's chock-a-block full of fossils. Bryozoans or lace corals, crinoids. Here's corals and more crinoids. These are horn corals that are all jumbled up. They're all found in this red wall limestone. You can see it from river mile 23.5, where we get down that level as we go down the sequence, all the way to the end of the Grand Canyon. But the same red wall limestone is found up in Wyoming. Now you see, when the geologists were naming the rock layers, they didn't have these to talk to one another. So the geologist in Wyoming called it the Madison limestone, but the guy down in the Grand Canyon called it the Red Wall limestone. It's only as geologists started talking to one another, in fact the oil companies did us a favour. Back in the 1980s, they did a project looking at all the outcrops and all the drill holes to show how these layers were connected to one another. So this is the same limestone with the same fossils up there in Wyoming, and we can trace that limestone, by the way, all across the United States. It's the same limestone at Mammoth Caves. The Red Wall limestone has got caves in it. It's the same limestone at Mammoth Caves in Kentucky. It's the same limestone in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, where you've got the Shenandoah Caverns. And the same limestone can be traced across to Ireland. The famous Burren is the same limestone. I went to Ross Castle in Killarney and I couldn't believe my eyes. The castle was built on the same limestone as the Grand Canyon. The Red Wall limestone had the same features in it. the same fossils. And it's the same limestone in the Yorkshire Dales of England, and it's the same limestone all the way across to the Himalayas. Isn't that what you'd expect to find from a global flood? Layers that can be traced not only across continents, but between continents. Down the bottom of the Grand Canyon, we have a layer called the Tapeats sandstone, because there's other sandstone layers as well. That only looks like a small cliff, but actually those cliffs are up to 300 feet high. They're quite high. And we've discovered from the work that was done in the 1980s by the oil field geologists that these layers that we find in the Grand Canyon belong to 5 large sequences of rock layers called mega sequences that can be shown to be the result of the ocean waters rising up, depositing layers, then going back down again, then rising up again. And these mega sequences can be traced right across North America, South America, Asia, Africa, Europe and Australia. We haven't done it in Antarctica yet, but we should be able to demonstrate that the same layers are found in that area as well, because we know there's coal layers down in Antarctica. That's right, coal layers, C-O-A-L. That, you know, the black stuff. I have to spell it out because you mightn't understand my accent. And by the way, would there still be tides during the flood? Absolutely, the moon was still up there. And in fact, on a global ocean, the tides would have oscillated by hundreds of feet. And then there were earthquakes because there were earth movements. As the fountains of the great deep broke open, the earth was split apart. You heard of plate tectonics, some of you high schoolers? Continental drift? No, continental sprint. The first person to recognise it was a flood geologist, a Christian, who thought, yes, looked at the comparison of fitted back the Atlantic Ocean. The Bible says that God gathered the waters together in one place and the land was in one place. That's why God could bring the animals to Noah to go on the ark, because they're all in the one supercontinent. And that supercontinent broke apart during the flood, and that's how we got the Himalayas, because some of those, India collided with Asia and up went the Himalayas. You know, 2 cars colliding at 1 mile an hour each, will they do much damage? No. Continental drift will not produce high mountains. Continental sprint with tens of feet per second slam like that will push up the layers. And so earthquakes, that means you're going to have tsunamis. Okay? And that means animals swimming in the waters, suddenly the water level drops because the tsunami has passed and it's now low tide. A dinosaur will walk across a mud flat, and then the waters come in and bury those footprints, and we've got fossilised footprints. Every argument that the skeptics use to try and tell you that the flood never occurred, we can answer those. This Tapeats sandstone can be traced right across North America. Here it is in the Grand Canyon. Underneath is the crystalline foundation rocks of the North American continent. Between them is an erosion surface. And in fact, the secularists recognise that this erosion surface goes all around the globe. And the evidence in the Grand Canyon is that thousands of feet of pre-flood rocks were eroded away. So where did the sediment come from for the flood? From the erosion of the pre-flood continent. God was going to blot out, he was going to wipe out and destroy the earth. He absolutely eroded away the pre-flood land surface. And one of the first layers was the Tapeats sandstone on top of that erosion surface. We can go to Chippewa Falls in Wisconsin. What do we find? That crystalline foundation rock, an erosion surface, and then the Tapeats sandstone. We go to southern Israel, to Timnah. We find the same crystalline basement foundation rock. We find the erosion surface. We find the Tapeats sandstone equivalent. In fact, we can find it from right across North America, right across northern Africa, over there to southern Israel, And just in recent years, the documentation, we can find it again in East China and in South Korea. And so we can trace it here, as we've done here. The yellow is the Tepete sandstone, and now we find it, the same features, the same sandstone at the same, on top of the same crystalline basement rocks with the erosion surface. It fits. Here's another Australian example, which tells us how quickly some of these sediments were deposited. That's an iconic Australian landform. That's almost in the geographical centre of Australia. Uluru is the Aboriginal name, or Ayers Rock, named after the surveyor who discovered it in the mid-1800s. And you see those striations, see those lines? They're the layers that have been tilted upright, almost upright. So they're sandstone layers that have been tilted up almost upright. And we can figure out how thick these sandstone layers were. In fact, they continue we can drill under the surrounding desert sands and still find that these layers were up to 18 to 20,000 feet thick, that are now, they were originally deposited flat like that and being tilted up like that. Such was the forces that were at work, earth movements, during the flood. And because of the minerals that are in the sand grains, we know that the sand was eroded and transported at least 60 miles. We go and look under a microscope, that's right. We geologists collect a sample and we grind it, we glue a piece to a microscope slide, we grind it down till it's paper thin, and then we can pass light through and study the minerals. And notice here, the grains are all different sizes. Have you ever experimented, you do this in a homeschool lab, where you get a glass jar, put water in it, sand and mud, put a lid on it, shake it up and let it settle out? Okay? With movement of water, the coarser grains settle first and then the lighter grains on top. We've got a mixture here. That means it happens so rapidly, there was no time for sorting to take place. And then we notice that many of these grains are jagged. Over time, grains will abrade against one another and they'll get rounded. So again, this indicates it was so quick, there was no time for rounding of these grains. And furthermore, we find a mineral called feldspar, which is the pink mineral in many granites. It's in this sandstone. It weathers very quickly. The very fact that we find it in this sandstone indicates that it was buried very rapidly. And so, putting this evidence together, it implies that there were sediment slurries. We know from present-day studies that these can travel as fast as 70 miles per hour. They would have transported 20,000 feet of sand in a matter of hours to produce this sandstone. That's not the sort of slow and gradual conditions we see today. That's stupendous, catastrophic evidence during the flood. Now, my last example before we wrap this up, you're probably getting very hungry and restless. A friend of mine, geologists are interested in all sorts of features. You get ripples, ripple marks in shallow water. We actually find fossilised ripple marks in many rock layers. And we find other direct indicators of the direction in which the waters were flowing when the sediments were laid down and the fossils were laid down. Sometimes we find the fossils are lined up, which means the water was flowing in a particular direction. Well, a friend of mine went around the world collecting the data and to show which way the directions were flowing when all these layers were deposited. And he's done 6 of the 7 continents. You know what we find? That the water was flowing essentially the same direction, from east to west. Which way do the tides flow? East to west. The global ocean, east to west. Isn't that fascinating? When all these layers were deposited. Well, the outcomes of the flood. After the flood, there was a whole new world with distinctive seasons. We're told that they would persist. That's why we know that man isn't going to destroy the planet. God controls the thermostat. God has promised the seasons will come and go at a regular cycle. You know, this outcome makes no sense if the flood was only global. God promised, while the earth remains, there'll be seed time and harvest, heat, summer and winter, day and night. So we don't have to get bent out of shape. You can go back in history and there was a mini ice age. There was a medieval warm period that's warmer than what we're experiencing today. And God put a rainbow in the sky as his sign of his covenant promise they'd never destroy the earth again. That doesn't make any sense if the flood was only local. Because if the flood was only local, then God has broken his promise many times since. God promised they'd never send the flood, another global flood again. Finally, God hates sin. You think about it. Man was so utterly corrupt that God went to the extent of wiping man out totally. God judged and he hates sin. And so it's a reminder, no one is going to escape from God's judgment. You and I need to remind ourselves daily that God sees and knows everything we do, we think, we say. He witnesses it. And he hates sin. Very, very challenging and sobering thought. See, God saw the wickedness of man. Even every intention of his thoughts was only evil continually. And that's why God destroyed man off the face of the earth. Yes, God's eyes are pure. He cannot look or countenance wrongdoing. Men will always fail. Even righteous Noah failed. Remember, he got drunk and was naked? He failed. Noah's descendants failed. Even those that remembered the flood chose to rebel against God's command to go and fill the earth. So what do? They went and built a tower, the Tower of Babel, or Babel. God had to judge them again for them to learn the lesson and obey him. Yet God is gracious and merciful. By the way, Colonel Williams mentioned the oil that was, that fire you could see from space. You think about it. The coal and the oil are a product of the flood. Buried vegetation, buried algae to produce the oil. Even when God was judging the earth, in his mercy, he was providing resources for us to use in the post-flood world. An incredible picture of God's grace and mercy. Peter reminds us the Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise, but is patient, not willing that any should perish, but all should come to repentance. But remember, God was always sovereign and in control of the flood. God chose Noah and his wife. God commanded Noah to build the ark. God brought the animals to Noah. God closed the door. God broke up the fountains of the great deep and opened the windows of heaven. God closed the fountains. God closed the windows. God sent the wind. God told Noah to get off the ark. See, God was in control. We cannot lose fact that the flood was under God's total control and his grace and mercy was on display there. There was only one way to escape the flood judgment. Only those that entered through the door, one door, which God alone closed, was saved. Jesus said, I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go out, in and out, and find pasture. God requires obedience. Noah obeyed every one of God's instructions. That's why he was saved, because he was obedient to God. Noah did all that the Lord had commanded him. Noah did all that the Lord had commanded him. The reality of the global flood teaches us that God means business and he keeps his word. Jesus warned us that in Noah's day the flood came and took them all away. No one knows when the final day of judgment will come, when Jesus will return. Maybe tomorrow. Hallelujah. Wouldn't that be wonderful if Jesus returned tomorrow? But are you ready? Because judgment will come and it will be swift. No one knows the day nor the hour, only the Father. So don't set dates. Only the Father knows. But you see, in the days of Noah, they didn't know exactly when it was coming either. But the flood came and swept them all away because they didn't accept the invitation to go with Noah onto the ark. So, are you ready? That's the challenge this morning as we close. If God comes tomorrow, Jesus comes tomorrow, are you prepared to face what comes next? After death, the judgment. Well, God bless you. Thank you for your attention.